Hi, I'm Marcus. My family stole $80,000 from my inheritance while I was deployed overseas, then had the nerve to invite me to my sister's wedding funded with my own money. When I found out, something inside me snapped, but not the way they expected. They thought I was just another pushover veteran who'd take it quietly and move on. What they didn't know was that Grandma Rose had taught me a thing or two about keeping records and protecting what's yours. The look on their faces when the sheriff showed up with the court papers. That was just the beginning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I remember the exact moment my world shifted. It wasn't dramatic, no thunderclap or sudden revelation. I was sitting in a cramped internet cafe in Kandahar, Afghanistan, trying to video call home after 3 months of radio silence. The connection kept cutting out, pixels freezing mid-sentence as my mom's face dissolved into digital squares. But I caught enough of what she said to feel my stomach drop through the concrete floor. She was talking about renovations. New kitchen cabinets, marble countertops, a backyard pool that cost more than most people make in a year. My sister Emma's engagement party had apparently been this lavish affair with a live band and catered food for 200 guests. Dad had bought himself a new truck. Something about finally treating himself after years of hard work. Mom laughed as she described their recent vacation to Europe, how they'd always dreamed of seeing the Italian countryside. I sat there in that sweltering internet cafe, surrounded by the hum of generators and the distant sound of helicopters, trying to process what I was hearing. When I'd left for deployment 8 months earlier, my parents were worried about making their mortgage payments. Mom had been clipping coupons, and Dad was working overtime just to keep the lights on. Now they were talking like they'd won the lottery. The call dropped again, and I stared at the blank screen for a long time. Something wasn't adding up, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Maybe they'd gotten promotions, or Dad's construction business had finally taken off the way he'd always hoped. I wanted to believe there was a simple explanation, some good fortune that had turned their financial situation around while I was gone. 3 weeks later, I got the letter that changed everything. It was from Peterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled Grandma Rose's estate. The letterhead was official, all crisp edges and embossed logos, the kind of formal correspondence that makes your palms sweat before you even open it. I found a quiet spot behind the communications tent and tore it open with hands that had diffused bombs but somehow trembled over a piece of paper. The letter was brief and to the point. There had been an irregularity with the inheritance distribution. They needed me to contact them immediately upon my return to the States. Something about unauthorized withdrawals and missing documentation. The attorney, a man named David Peterson, whom I'd met briefly at Grandma's funeral, had tried to reach me through military channels but hadn't been able to get through. I read the letter 3 times, each pass making my chest tighter. Grandma Rose had left me $80,000, money she'd saved over decades of working double shifts at the textile mill. She'd been careful with every penny, darning socks until they were more thread than original fabric, growing her own vegetables even when she could afford to buy them. That money represented a lifetime of sacrifice, and she'd wanted it to help me start fresh when I got back from the war. The letter didn't spell out exactly what had happened, but the implications were clear enough. Someone had accessed my inheritance, and it wasn't me. I was 8,000 miles away, carrying a rifle through villages most Americans couldn't find on a map. I hadn't touched a single dollar of Grandma's money because I'd been too busy staying alive. That night, I lay on my narrow bunk and stared at the canvas ceiling of my tent. Around me, other soldiers snored or whispered into satellite phones, talking to wives and girlfriends and children they hadn't seen in months. I thought about Grandma Rose, how she used to sit on her front porch shelling peas and telling me stories about the old days. She'd been the only one who really understood me, who saw past the anger and confusion of my teenage years to something worth saving. When I was 17 and getting into trouble more often than not, she'd sat me down at her kitchen table and made me a deal. If I cleaned up my act and graduated high school, she'd help me pay for college. If I decided to join the military instead, she'd make sure I had something waiting for me when I got back. Either way, she said, I wasn't going to end up like my father, working construction jobs that broke his back for barely enough money to survive. She'd kept her word, even after she died. The $80,000 was supposed to be my foundation, my chance to build something better than the cycle of barely getting by that had defined my family for generations. Now, according to this letter, that money was gone, and I had a sinking feeling about where it had ended up. I tried calling home the next day, but the time difference made it impossible to reach anyone when they weren't at work. When I finally got through to Mom 2 days later, I asked her directly about the inheritance. Her response made my blood run cold. "Oh honey, we had to take care of some family expenses," she said, her voice bright and casual as if she was talking about borrowing sugar from a neighbor. "Don't worry about it, we'll figure everything out when you get home. Besides, you don't need all that money right away, do you? You're young, you've got time to build up your savings." I pressed her for details, but she deflected every question with the same breezy dismissal. "It was family business," she said. "Emergency situations that couldn't wait." The money was safe, she promised, just being used for important things that would benefit everyone in the long run. When I asked specifically what emergencies had required $80,000, she got defensive. "Marcus, I don't appreciate this tone," she said, her voice sharp now. "We're your family, we took care of you your whole life, and now when we need a little help, you're acting like we're criminals or something. Grandma Rose would be ashamed of how selfish you're being." The connection was crystal clear that day, no pixelated freeze frames or dropped calls. I heard every word perfectly, including the click when she hung up on me. I sat there holding the phone, staring at the dusty ground beneath my boots, feeling like I'd been sucker punched by someone I trusted completely. That night, I wrote a letter to David Peterson. I had to use the old-fashioned mail system because internet access was limited, and some things were too important to trust to spotty Wi-Fi connections. I told him about the conversation with my mother, and asked him to freeze any remaining assets from the inheritance until I could return. I also asked him to provide me with a complete accounting of all withdrawals and transactions related to the estate. His response came 3 weeks later, and it was worse than I'd imagined. The entire $80,000 was gone, withdrawn in a series of transfers over the past 6 months. Each withdrawal had been authorized by someone claiming to be me, using a power of attorney document that I'd never signed. The signature looked close enough to mine that the bank had accepted it without question, especially since my mother had been present to verify my identity during the initial setup. According to Peterson's investigation, the first withdrawal had happened just 2 weeks after I'd deployed. $10,000, supposedly for emergency medical expenses, then another $15,000 a month later for urgent home repairs. The withdrawals had continued steadily, each one accompanied by documentation that looked official but had never passed through my hands. Peterson had tried to contact me through military channels as soon as he'd discovered the irregularities, but the paperwork had gotten lost in the bureaucratic maze that governed communication with deployed troops. By the time his letter reached me, the damage was done. My inheritance was gone, and my family had used it to fund their new lifestyle while I was risking my life in a desert on the other side of the world. I spent the remaining 2 months of my deployment in a strange kind of emotional limbo. During the day, I focused on my duties, leading patrols and training Afghan police officers and trying not to think about what was waiting for me back home. But at night, lying in my bunk listening to the distant rumble of convoys and helicopters, I couldn't stop my mind from racing through different scenarios. Maybe there was an explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe there really had been emergencies that justified the withdrawals, and my family was planning to pay me back once I returned. Maybe the power of attorney document was legitimate, something I'd signed during the rushed preparation for deployment and then forgotten about in the chaos of leaving. But deep down, I knew better. I remembered Grandma Rose's stories about her own family, how her brothers had tried to cheat her out of her share of their father's farm back in the 1950s. She'd fought them in court for 3 years and won, but the experience had taught her to be careful about money and trust. She drilled those lessons into me from an early age, always reminding me to keep good records and never let anyone take advantage of my good nature. The more I thought about it, the more details started clicking into place. The timing of the withdrawals coincided perfectly with my family's sudden prosperity. The amounts matched up with the expensive purchases my mother had mentioned during our video calls. Even the descriptions on the bank documents made sense now, disguised as emergencies and necessities but actually funding luxuries they couldn't otherwise afford. By the time my deployment ended, I'd made peace with the situation in my own mind. I wasn't angry exactly, though there was certainly anger mixed in with the hurt and disappointment. What I felt most was a kind of clear-eyed determination. My family had stolen from me, and they'd done it while I was serving my country in a war zone. That crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and there would be consequences. The flight home felt longer than the 8 months I'd spent overseas. I sat in a cramped middle seat between a businessman who kept checking his phone and a college student who slept through most of the journey. Outside the window, America stretched out below me in a patchwork of green fields and sprawling cities, beautiful and familiar, and somehow foreign after so much time away. I'd changed during those 8 months in ways that went deeper than the tan lines from my gear, or the small scar above my left eyebrow from a piece of shrapnel that had gotten too close. I'd learned things about myself and about the world that couldn't be unlearned. I'd seen what happened when people betrayed trust, how quickly order could break down when everyone stopped looking out for each other. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between family you're born into and family you choose. The airport in Atlanta was chaos, all bright lights and rushing crowds and the overwhelming smell of fast food and cleaning supplies. I shouldered my duffel bag and made my way through the terminal, following signs toward ground transportation. I told my family not to pick me up, claiming I wanted to decompress a little before jumping back into civilian life. The truth was, I needed time to prepare for what was coming next. I caught a bus to the small town where I'd grown up, watching familiar landmarks roll past the windows. The water tower with the high school mascot painted on the side, still faded and peeling after all these years. The diner where I'd worked weekends during senior year, now boarded up and covered in graffiti. The Methodist church where I'd been baptized as a child, its white steeple still pointing toward a sky that seemed impossibly blue after months of desert beige. Nothing had changed, but everything felt different. Or maybe I was the one who was different, looking at it all through eyes that had seen too much and understood too little about how the world really worked. I got off the bus downtown and walked the 6 blocks to Peterson and Associates. The law office was in an old Victorian house that had been converted to commercial space, all dark wood and brass fixtures that spoke of respectability and tradition. David Peterson met me in the lobby, a thin man in his 60s with gray hair and the kind of patient expression that comes from decades of dealing with family disputes. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming in. I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances." We sat in his office while he laid out the full scope of what had happened. The power of attorney document was sophisticated, bearing a signature that closely resembled mine, and notarized with all the proper seals and documentation. Whoever had created it had done their homework, including details about my military service and deployment schedule that wouldn't have been public knowledge. "The signature analysis isn't conclusive," Peterson explained, sliding a copy of the document across his desk. "It's close enough to yours that a handwriting expert couldn't definitively prove forgery, especially since signatures naturally vary over time. But the notarization is where things get interesting." He pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of a notary public I'd never heard of. According to the records, I'd appeared before this notary in person on a Tuesday afternoon in March, just 3 days after my deployment had begun. The problem was, I could prove I'd been on a military transport plane somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean at the exact time the document claimed. "I was in a notary's office in Georgia. We can prove you weren't in the country when this was supposedly signed," Peterson said. "Your military travel records are ironclad. The question is whether we can prove who actually—" I studied the signature, holding it up to the light streaming through Peterson's office window. It was close to mine. Close enough to fool someone who didn't know my handwriting intimately. But there were subtle differences in the way certain letters were formed, small variations that told a story if you knew how to read them. "I need to see the video footage from the notary's office," I said. Peterson raised an eyebrow. "Most notaries don't keep video records going back that far." "This one might," I said, remembering something Grandma Rose had taught me about being thorough in your research. "It's worth checking." 2 days later, Peterson called with news that changed everything. The notary had been required by her insurance company to keep security footage for a full year, and she still had the recordings from March. The video clearly showed someone signing the power of attorney document, but it wasn't me, it was my father. I watched the footage in Peterson's office, sitting in the same chair where I'd learned the full extent of my family's betrayal. The video quality wasn't great, but it was clear enough to see Dad's face as he signed my name to the document that would give him access to my inheritance. He'd even practiced my signature, the movements deliberate and careful as he forged my name with the notary watching.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The notary herself was obviously in on the scheme. She barely glanced at the identification Dad provided, didn't ask any of the questions she was legally required to ask, and notarized the document without following proper procedures. Later investigation would reveal that she was a family friend, someone who owed Dad money from a failed business deal years earlier. "This is enough for criminal charges," Peterson said after we'd watched the footage twice. "Wire fraud, forgery, theft by deception. Your father could be looking at serious prison time, and anyone else who participated could face charges as accomplices." I sat in silence for a long time, processing what I'd just seen. It was one thing to suspect your family of stealing from you, another thing entirely to watch the proof play out on a computer screen. The calculated nature of it was what hurt the most. This wasn't a moment of weakness or desperation. Dad had planned this carefully, recruited accomplices, and executed the theft while I was serving my country overseas. "What about the money?" I asked finally. Peterson's expression grew even more serious. "That's where things get complicated. They've spent most of it already. The house renovations, the car, the vacation, your sister's engagement party. We could force them to sell assets to pay you back, but it would probably require a lengthy court battle." I thought about Grandma Rose, about the lessons she'd tried to teach me about standing up for yourself and protecting what's yours. She'd always said that sometimes doing the right thing was harder than doing the easy thing, but that was exactly when it mattered most. "File the charges," I said. "All of them." Peterson nodded slowly. "Are you sure? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family will be permanently damaged." I looked out his office window at the town where I'd grown up, the place I'd always thought of as home. For the first time since I'd returned from deployment, I felt a sense of clarity about what came next. "They damaged that relationship when they decided to steal from me," I said. "I'm just making sure there are consequences." That evening I drove to my parents' house for the first time since returning from overseas. The place looked different now that I knew how they'd paid for the improvements. The new siding and windows that I'd assumed came from Dad's construction business. The landscaping that had transformed their modest yard into something worthy of a home and garden magazine. Even the mailbox was new, painted to match the house with brass numbers that gleamed in the late afternoon sun. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, gathering my thoughts. Part of me hoped there was still an explanation I hadn't considered, some last-minute revelation that would make sense of everything and let me go back to thinking of them as the flawed but loving family I'd grown up with. Mom answered the door before I could knock, pulling me into a hug that felt warm and familiar, and completely wrong given what I now knew. "Marcus, oh honey, you look so thin. Come in, come in. I've got a roast in the oven, your favorite." The house smelled like home, like the Sunday dinners of my childhood, and the Christmas mornings when I'd believed the world was fundamentally fair and good. But underneath the familiar scents, I detected something else. New carpet, fresh paint, the lingering chemical smell of recent renovations. Dad emerged from the living room, wiping his hands on a dish towel and grinning like everything was normal. "There's our war hero," he said, clapping me on the shoulder with the same rough affection he'd shown me my whole life. "How was the flight? You must be exhausted." We sat around the kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework and eaten countless meals, now positioned to show off the new granite countertops and stainless steel appliances. Mom bustled around, serving food and asking questions about deployment and military life, carefully avoiding any mention of money or inheritances, or the power of attorney document that had started this whole mess. I played along for a while, answering their questions and letting them tell me about everything that had happened while I was gone. Dad had landed a big commercial contract, he said, which explained their improved financial situation. Mom had gotten a promotion at the insurance office where she worked part-time. They were just blessed, they kept saying, finally getting a break, after years of struggling to make ends meet. Speaking of blessings, Mom said, refilling my water glass, "Emma's engagement party is next weekend.
You'll be able to make it, won't you? She's been so excited about having her big brother there. I looked across the table at my parents, these people who had raised me and loved me and taught me the difference between right and wrong, and felt a sadness deeper than anything I'd experienced in the war zone. They were sitting there lying to my face, acting like concerned parents while they spent money they'd stolen from their son. Actually, I said, setting down my fork, I need to talk to you both about something important. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate. Dad's smile faded, and Mom's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. They knew, I realized. They'd been waiting for this conversation since the moment I'd walked through their door. I met with David Peterson today, I continued, watching their faces carefully. About Grandma Rose's inheritance. Mom was the first to recover, pasting on a bright smile that didn't reach her eyes. Oh, that's nice, dear. How is David? Such a sweet man. He showed me some interesting documents, I said, including a power of attorney that supposedly gives you access to my inheritance account. Dad cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in his dinner plate. Now Marcus, before you get all worked up, let me explain how that happened. But I held up my hand to stop him. I've seen the security footage from the notary's office, Dad. I know it was you who signed my name. The silence that followed was the kind that changes everything, the moment when pretenses fall away and everyone has to face the truth of what they've done. Mom's face crumpled, and Dad's shoulders sagged like he'd been carrying a weight he could finally set down. We were going to pay you back, Mom said quietly. It was just temporary, until we could get back on our feet. $80,000, I said. Every penny Grandma Rose saved for my future, gone. Dad finally looked up, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not shame, exactly, but a kind of desperate defensiveness that made him look smaller than I remembered. You don't understand the pressure we were under, he said. The mortgage was behind, your mother's car was about to be repossessed, Emma needed money for college. We're family, Marcus. Family helps each other out. Family asks, I replied. Family doesn't forge documents and steal money while their son is deployed in a war zone. The argument that followed was ugly and painful and necessary. They tried every tactic in the book, from guilt to anger to tearful pleas for understanding. I was being ungrateful, they said, selfish. Didn't I understand that Grandma Rose would have wanted her money to help the whole family, not just me? But I'd had 2 months to think about this moment, 2 months to prepare for exactly these arguments. I stayed calm and focused, laying out the facts without letting emotion cloud my judgment. They had committed multiple felonies. They had stolen money that didn't belong to them. They had betrayed my trust, while I was serving my country. So what happens now? Dad asked finally, his voice hoarse from shouting. I stood up from the table, looking around the kitchen one last time. Tomorrow the sheriff would serve them with court papers. Within a week they'd be arrested and charged with wire fraud, forgery, and theft. Their assets would be frozen pending the outcome of the trial, which meant they'd probably lose the house and everything they'd bought with my money. Now you face the consequences of what you've done, I said. I walked to the front door, leaving them sitting at that kitchen table in the house they'd renovated with stolen money. As I reached for the doorknob, Mom called out behind me, Marcus, please, you're our son, don't let money destroy our family. I turned back to look at her, this woman who had bandaged my childhood scrapes and cheered at my high school graduation and cried when I left for military training. You destroyed our family the moment you decided to steal from me, I said. I'm just making sure everyone knows what really happened. The drive back to my hotel was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy with possibility. I'd crossed a line tonight, and there was no going back. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and court papers and the beginning of a legal process that would tear my family apart. But for the first time since I'd gotten Peterson's letter, I felt like I was doing what Grandma Rose would have wanted me to do. I was standing up for myself, protecting what was mine, and making sure there were consequences for betrayal. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty, but it was going to be right, and sometimes that's all you can do. The sheriff arrived at my parents' house on a Tuesday morning, while I was sitting in a diner 3 blocks away, nursing my 3rd cup of coffee and watching the clock. I'd positioned myself at a window booth where I could see their street, not because I wanted to witness their humiliation, but because I needed to know it was really happening. After months of lies and deception, I'd learned not to trust anything until I could verify it with my own eyes. Deputy Sarah Chen was the one who knocked on their door, a woman I'd gone to high school with who now carried herself with the quiet authority that comes from years of delivering bad news to people who thought they were untouchable. I watched through the diner window as she handed Mom the court papers, saw Dad appear in the doorway still wearing his pajamas and the confused expression of a man who'd convinced himself this day would never come. My phone buzzed with a text from Peterson's office confirming what I was witnessing. Papers served. Initial hearing scheduled for next Friday. Criminal charges filed separately. The legal machinery was finally in motion, and there was no stopping it now. I finished my coffee and drove to the small apartment I'd rented on the outskirts of town, a furnished one-bedroom place that felt temporary and safe in a way my childhood home never would again. The walls were painted institutional white, and the furniture looked like it had been ordered from a catalog, but it was mine in a way that mattered. No one could take it from me, because I'd paid for it myself, with money I'd earned carrying a rifle through places most people couldn't imagine. The first call came 20 minutes later. Mom's voice was shaky and higher than normal, the way it got when she was trying not to cry in front of other people. "Marcus, honey, there's been some kind of mistake. The sheriff was just here, and she gave us these papers that don't make any sense. Something about fraud and theft charges. We need you to call your lawyer friend and get this straightened out." I let her talk for a while, listening to her construct a reality where this was all some bureaucratic error that could be fixed with a phone call and an apology. In her version of events, they were the victims of a misunderstanding, innocent people caught up in legal proceedings they didn't understand. "There's no mistake, Mom," I said finally. "You stole $80,000 from me, and now you're facing the consequences." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice had changed completely, dropping the confused victim act for something sharper and more desperate. "You're really going to destroy your own family over money. Your sister's wedding is in 6 weeks, Marcus. 6 weeks. Do you want her to remember her wedding day as the time her brother sent her parents to jail? Emma's wedding. I'd been wondering when they'd bring that up, wondering how they'd try to use my sister's happiness as leverage against me."
Emma, who'd been planning this day since she was 12 years old, who'd already sent out invitations and ordered flowers and reserved the church where 3 generations of our family had been married. "Did you think about Emma's wedding when you forged my signature?" I asked. "Did you think about how it would affect her when you decided to build her engagement party with stolen money? That's different, and you know it," Mom snapped. "We're family. Family takes care of each other, Marcus. That money was just sitting there doing nothing while we were struggling to make ends meet." The conversation devolved from there into the same circular arguments we'd had at the kitchen table, but with higher stakes now that the legal system was involved. She tried guilt, anger, bargaining, and finally threats, warning me that I'd regret this decision for the rest of my life. When I hung up on her, my hands were steady and my conscience was clear. Dad called an hour later, and his approach was different. No tears or emotional manipulation, just the voice of a man trying to negotiate his way out of a corner he'd painted himself into. "Son, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. What we did was wrong, and we should have asked permission first, but let's be practical here. You take me to court, I lose my contractor's license. Your mother loses her job when this gets out. Emma's wedding gets canceled, and she'll hate you forever. Nobody wins." He painted a picture of mutual destruction, a scenario where my pursuit of justice would hurt everyone I'd ever cared about while accomplishing nothing positive. "The money was gone," he said. "Most of it anyway. Even if I won in court, I'd never recover the full amount because they'd have to sell the house at a loss and declare bankruptcy to pay the legal fees. But if you drop the charges now," he continued, "we can work something out between family, payment plan, maybe. Sell some things, refinance the house. It'll take time, but we'll make this right." I listened to his proposal, hearing the practiced smoothness that had made him successful in the construction business. He was good at this, at finding the angle that made people want to say yes even when their instincts told them to run. But I'd learned something about myself during those long nights in Afghanistan, something about the difference between being reasonable and being taken advantage of. "You had 8 months to make this right," I told him. 8 months while I was getting shot at in a desert. Instead you threw Emma an engagement party with my money and bought Mom a new car. The time for family negotiations is over." "Don't be stupid, Marcus." Dad's voice turned hard, revealing the anger beneath his reasonable exterior. "You think you're teaching us some kind of lesson, but all you're doing is burning bridges you can't rebuild. We're the only family you've got, son. You go through with this, and you'll be alone." The threat was clear, and it might have worked on the version of myself who'd left for deployment all those months ago.
But I'd been alone before, in ways that had nothing to do with family relationships. I'd learned that being alone was sometimes better than being surrounded by people who saw you as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected. "I'd rather be alone than be your victim," I said, and hung up. The next few days passed in a strange kind of limbo. I went through the motions of civilian life, grocery shopping and doing laundry, and trying to figure out what came next for someone whose entire support system had just imploded. The town felt different now, smaller and more claustrophobic, as if everyone was watching me and taking sides in a conflict they didn't fully understand. Some people were supportive in quiet ways. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store slipped me an extra discount when I bought supplies for my apartment. Frank Martinez, who'd served in Vietnam, bought me coffee at the diner and told me about his own family's struggles after the war. These small gestures meant more than I could express, proof that some people understood the difference between loyalty and enabling. But there were others who made their disapproval clear. The checkout clerk at the grocery store who'd known my family for years suddenly became cold and professional. Former classmates who crossed the street to avoid talking to me. The whispered conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. The small-town judgment machine was cranking up, and I was being painted as the ungrateful son who'd chosen money over family. Emma called on Thursday night, 3 days before the first court hearing. I'd been expecting her call, dreading it in a way that went deeper than my conflicts with Mom and Dad. Emma was different from the rest of them, or at least I'd always wanted to believe she was. She was the baby of the family, 8 years younger than me, someone I'd helped raise during the years when Dad was working constantly and Mom was struggling with depression. "Marcus, please," she said without preamble, her voice thick with tears, "please don't do this to them. I know they screwed up, but they're still our parents. This is going to destroy everything." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my cheap apartment chair, feeling the weight of 26 years of big brother responsibility settling on my shoulders. Emma had always been my soft spot, the one person in the family I'd have done anything to protect. When she was little and had nightmares, I was the one who sat by her bed until she fell back asleep. When kids at school made fun of her thick glasses, I was the one who made sure they stopped. "They destroyed everything when they decided to steal from me," I said gently. "I'm just making sure there are consequences. But my wedding, Marcus, everything's already paid for, all the deposits and reservations. If Dad gets arrested, if they lose the house, I'll have to cancel everything." Is that really what Grandma Rose would have wanted? Her money being used to ruin her granddaughter's wedding day? The manipulation was subtler than what I'd gotten from Mom and Dad, wrapped in genuine emotion and real concern about her future. But it was still manipulation, still an attempt to make me responsible for consequences that other people had created through their own choices. Grandma Rose would have wanted her money to go to the person she chose to leave it to, I said. Not to be stolen by people who thought they deserved it more. Emma was quiet for a long time, and when she spoke again, her voice was small and defeated. "So that's it, you've made up your mind, and the rest of us just have to live with whatever happens." "You don't have to live with anything, Emma. You can distance yourself from what Mom and Dad did, make it clear that you weren't involved in their decisions. You can still have your wedding, just maybe not the version they planned with stolen money." "You don't understand," she said, and now there was anger creeping into her voice. "This isn't just about the money, this is about you choosing to be vindictive instead of forgiving. This is about you deciding that being right is more important than being family." The conversation ended badly, with Emma hanging up on me after delivering a speech about how disappointed she was in the man I'd become. I sat in my apartment afterward, staring at a framed photo of the two of us from her high school graduation, wondering if I was making the right choice or just being stubborn in a way that would cost me everyone I'd ever loved. But then I thought about Grandma Rose, about the story she used to tell about standing up to her brothers when they tried to cheat her out of her inheritance. She'd been alone after that fight, ostracized from a family that thought she should have kept quiet and taken whatever scraps they were willing to give her. But she'd also been proud of herself for refusing to be a victim, even when it cost her relationships she'd valued. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes everything look washed out and tired. I put on the only suit I owned, a black one I'd bought for military funerals, and drove to the courthouse where my family's fate would begin to be decided. The building was old and imposing, all red brick and white columns that spoke of justice and tradition and the weight of legal precedent. I'd been inside once before for a field trip in 8th grade, but it felt different now that I was here as a participant, rather than an observer. Peterson met me in the lobby, looking professional and confident in a way that helped settle my nerves. We went over the proceedings one more time, the formal reading of charges and the initial plea that would set everything in motion. This wasn't the trial, he reminded me, just the beginning of a process that could take months to resolve. "Are you ready for this?" he asked as we climbed the stairs to the courtroom. I thought about the question seriously, weighing everything I was about to set in motion against everything I was about to lose. My parents would probably never forgive me. Emma might not speak to me for years. The town I'd grown up in would remember me as the man who sent his own family to jail over money. But I would also be able to look at myself in the mirror without feeling like a victim, without wondering what other lies I'd accepted because they came from people I trusted. "I'm ready," I said. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with dark wood paneling and fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh relief. My parents were already seated at the defendant's table with their public defender, a young woman who looked overwhelmed by the complexity of the case. They'd both dressed carefully for the occasion, Dad in a suit I'd never seen before, and Mom in a conservative dress that made her look older and more fragile than I remembered. They didn't look at me when I entered with Peterson, keeping their eyes focused straight ahead, as if acknowledging my presence would make this whole situation more real. Emma was in the gallery with her fiancé, Tommy, both of them looking like they were attending a funeral rather than a legal proceeding. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd presided over thousands of similar proceedings. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, including the family dynamics playing out in her courtroom. The formal reading of charges took less than 10 minutes: wire fraud, forgery, theft by deception, each count carrying potential prison time that made the whole proceeding feel surreal. These were the kind of charges you heard about on the news, affecting other people's families in other towns. They weren't supposed to apply to the people who'd raised you and taught you how to ride a bike. Dad stood when asked to enter his plea, his voice steady as he said, "Not guilty, Your Honor." Mom's voice was barely audible when she repeated the same words, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the defendant's table. The judge set a preliminary hearing date for 3 weeks out and addressed the question of bail. The prosecution argued that my parents were flight risks, people with the means and motivation to disappear rather than face the consequences of their actions. Peterson had prepared me for this possibility, warning me that they might spend some time in jail before the case was resolved. But their public defender made a compelling argument about community ties and the nonviolent nature of the crimes. Dad's construction business employed 6 people locally, she said, and shutting it down would hurt innocent workers who'd done nothing wrong. Mom volunteered at the library and taught Sunday school at their church, evidence of deep roots in the community. Judge Morrison listened to both sides before setting bail at $50,000 each, secured by liens on their house and remaining assets. It was a substantial amount, but not insurmountable given the equity they'd built up over the years. They'd be free pending trial, but under strict conditions that included surrendering their passports and checking in weekly with a probation officer. The hearing was over in less than an hour, but the walk to the parking lot felt like the longest of my life. I could feel eyes on me, could hear the whispered conversations of people who'd known my family for decades trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. Emma caught up with me as I reached my car, her face streaked with tears and twisted with an anger I'd never seen before. "Are you happy now?" she demanded. "Are you satisfied with what you've done to them?" I looked at my little sister, this person I'd loved and protected for most of her life, and felt the distance between us stretching like a canyon. She saw me as the villain in this story, the ungrateful son who'd chosen revenge over reconciliation. I saw myself as someone who'd finally learned the difference between family loyalty and enabling criminal behavior. "I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this," I said. "But I didn't create this situation, Emma. I'm just the one who refused to pretend it didn't happen." "Grandma Rose is probably rolling over in her grave," Emma shot back. "She loved this family, all of us. She wouldn't have wanted her money used to tear us apart. She left that money to me," I replied. "Not to Mom and Dad, not to the family in general. To me, and they stole it while I was serving my country in a war zone. If she's rolling over in her grave, it's because the people she trusted to honor her wishes decided to help themselves instead." Emma stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with the competing narratives in her head. The version where I was the villain and the version where I was the victim, both equally real depending on which angle you viewed them from. "I don't know who you are anymore," she said finally. "The brother I grew up with would never have done this to his own family." "The brother you grew up with never had his family steal from him," I replied. "Maybe you never really knew me at all."
She walked away without another word, leaving me standing in the courthouse parking lot feeling like I'd just lost the last person in the world who mattered to me. But as I drove home to my apartment, I realized that wasn't entirely true. I still had myself, and for the first time in months, I could respect the person looking back at me from the mirror. The next few weeks passed in a haze of legal preparations and small-town drama. The story had leaked to the local newspaper, a front-page article that laid out the basic facts while carefully avoiding any editorial commentary. But the comments section was brutal, filled with opinions from people who'd known my family for years and couldn't believe one of their own would air their dirty laundry in public. Some supported me, particularly other veterans who understood the violation of having your family steal from you while you were deployed. But others painted me as cold and calculating, someone who'd chosen money over family and would regret it for the rest of my life. The court of public opinion was split, and I found myself caught between competing narratives about what family loyalty really meant. Peterson called midway through the second week with news that changed the game entirely. His investigation had uncovered additional evidence, bank records that showed the theft was even more extensive than we'd originally discovered. Beyond the $80,000 from my inheritance, my parents had also accessed a small trust fund Grandma Rose had set up for Emma's education, draining another $12,000 that was supposed to pay for her college expenses. They forged her signature too, Peterson explained during our meeting. Same pattern, same notary, same basic method. "Emma has no idea the money's gone because the statements were being sent to your parents' address." I felt sick as the implications sank in. Emma's anger at me, her defense of our parents, her insistence that I was destroying the family over money. She didn't know they'd stolen from her too, that the college fund she was counting on had already been spent on home improvements and luxury purchases. "Does she need to know?" I asked. Peterson gave me a look that suggested I already knew the answer. "She's going to find out eventually, probably during discovery if this goes to trial. Better she hears it from you than from a prosecutor in open court." The conversation with Emma was one of the hardest I'd ever had to initiate. I called her that evening, sitting in my apartment and staring out at the parking lot while I worked up the courage to destroy what was left of her faith in our parents. "I don't want to talk to you," she said as soon as she heard my voice. "Emma, please. There's something you need to know about your college fund." The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. She'd been wondering about the money, probably trying to figure out how to pay for her upcoming wedding and the life she was planning with Tommy. The fund was supposed to be her safety net, the financial cushion that would let her start her marriage without the burden of debt. "What about my college fund?" she asked quietly. I told her everything: the forged documents, the unauthorized withdrawals, the systematic theft that had drained her account just like mine. I explained how Peterson had discovered the evidence and what it meant for the criminal case against our parents. Emma didn't say anything for a long time, and I could hear her breathing change as the full scope of the betrayal sank in. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. "How much is left?" "Nothing," I said. "They spent it all." The sound she made wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a scream, but something in between that conveyed a level of pain I'd hoped never to hear from her. I listened to my little sister fall apart over the phone, knowing that I'd just shattered the last of her illusions about the people who'd raised us. "My wedding," she whispered. "Tommy and we were counting on that money. The honeymoon, the down payment on our apartment. How am I supposed to tell him that it's all gone?" "I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry you have to go through this." "Are you?" The question came out sharper than I think she intended. "Are you really sorry, or are you glad that I finally see them the way you do?" I thought about her question seriously, examining my own motives and feelings with the kind of brutal honesty I'd learned in therapy after coming back from deployment. Was there a part of me that was relieved to no longer be the only victim, the only one who understood what our parents were really capable of? "I'm sorry you're hurting," I said finally, "but I'm glad you know the truth. You deserve to make your own decisions based on reality, not the lies they've been telling all of us." Emma was quiet for another long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed completely. The anger was gone, replaced by something that sounded like exhaustion. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you have a choice to make," I told her. "You can join the criminal case as another victim, or you can stay out of it and focus on your own life. Either way, you'll probably be called as a witness during the trial." "I can't do this right now," she said.
I can't process this. I need time to think. The call ended there, leaving me alone with the knowledge that I'd just cost my sister her faith in our parents and possibly her wedding plans as well, but I'd also given her the truth, which was more than anyone else in our family had been willing to offer. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Friday, a more detailed examination of the evidence that would determine whether the case would proceed to trial. Peterson was confident about our chances, especially with the additional evidence of Emma's stolen college fund, but he warned me that things might get ugly. "They're going to attack your character," he said during our preparation session. "Try to paint you as vindictive, ungrateful, someone who's using the legal system to settle family scores. You need to be ready for that." I spent the days leading up to the hearing trying to prepare mentally for what was coming. The defense would probably bring up my military service, suggesting that I'd been changed by combat in ways that made me vindictive and unreasonable. They might question my relationship with Grandma Rose, implying that I'd manipulated an elderly woman into leaving me money that should have gone to the whole family. But the hearing didn't go the way I'd expected. When Friday arrived, Peterson met me in the courthouse lobby with news that changed everything. "They want to plea bargain," he said without preamble. "Full restitution, guilty pleas to reduce charges, minimal jail time. They're ready to deal." I stared at him, trying to process what this meant. After weeks of public denials and family pressure and accusations of vindictiveness, my parents were suddenly ready to admit guilt and negotiate consequences. "What changed?" I asked. Peterson smiled grimly. "Emma hired her own lawyer yesterday. Filed a separate civil suit for the college fund theft. Suddenly they're facing criminal charges from 2 different victims, plus the possibility of additional civil penalties. Their public defender recommended they cut their losses while they still could." The plea negotiations took place in a conference room adjacent to the main courtroom, all beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and defeated. My parents sat across the table from Peterson and me, flanked by their public defender and a prosecutor who laid out the state's offer in clinical detail. Guilty pleas to theft charges, felonies that would go on their permanent records but with sentences that involved restitution and community service, rather than significant prison time. They would have to sell the house and use the proceeds to pay back what they'd stolen from Emma and me. Dad would lose his contractor's license for 5 years. Mom would be barred from handling financial accounts at her job, but they would avoid the wire fraud and forgery charges that carried much heavier sentences, and they would be able to keep their freedom while they worked to make restitution. "It's a good deal," Peterson murmured to me during a brief recess. "You'll get your money back, they'll face consequences for their actions, but nobody goes to prison for decades. It's probably the best outcome you could hope for." I looked across the room at my parents, these people who'd shaped my childhood and taught me my earliest lessons about right and wrong. Dad looked older than I remembered, gray around the temples and hollow-eyed in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Mom kept dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, but her tears struck me as calculated rather than genuine. They'd put themselves in this position through a series of deliberate choices, each one designed to benefit them at my expense. Now they were facing the consequences, and they wanted to negotiate their way to a softer landing. The part of me that remembered being their son wanted to show mercy, to find a way to heal the family wounds that this whole process had opened. But the part of me that had learned hard lessons about accountability in the military, the part that understood the difference between justice and revenge, knew that accepting this deal was the right thing to do. "I'll take it," I said. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a heavy door. Judge Morrison's voice carried no emotion as she accepted the plea agreement, her words transforming my parents from defendants into convicted felons with the stroke of a pen. Guilty on all counts. Restitution ordered in full. Sentencing in 30 days. I sat in the gallery watching them sign document after document, their signatures shaky but legally binding. Mom kept glancing back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between pleading and resentment. Dad stared straight ahead, his jaw set in the stubborn line I remembered from childhood arguments he'd already lost, but refused to acknowledge. The courthouse emptied slowly, lawyers gathering their papers and families processing what they'd just witnessed. Emma sat 3 rows behind me with Tommy, her face pale and drawn. She'd testified earlier about the college fund theft, her voice barely audible as she described discovering that her future had been sold to pay for home improvements she'd never asked for. Peterson packed his briefcase with the methodical precision that had made him such an effective advocate. "It's over," he said simply, and somehow those 2 words carried more weight than all the legal jargon that had preceded them. But I knew it wasn't really over. Legal resolution and personal healing were different creatures entirely, and while the court had delivered justice, the harder work of rebuilding a life from the wreckage was just beginning. The walk to the parking lot felt like emerging from a cave into bright sunlight, disorienting and harsh after months of legal proceedings. My parents were ahead of me, moving slowly toward their car like people walking to their own execution. They'd avoided looking at me throughout the entire hearing, as if acknowledging my presence would somehow make their shame more real. Emma caught up with me halfway across the asphalt, her steps quick and determined in a way that reminded me of Grandma Rose when she'd made up her mind about something. "Marcus, wait." I turned to face my sister, this person who'd been my responsibility for so many years and was now a stranger shaped by betrayals I'd been forced to expose. She looked older somehow, as if the past few months had aged her in ways that went beyond simple calendar time. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You were right about them, and I was wrong to attack you for telling the truth." The apology hit harder than I'd expected, carrying with it the weight of all the angry words we'd exchanged, and the distance that had grown between us. I wanted to accept it gracefully, to find some way to bridge the gap that circumstances had forced between us. "You don't owe me anything, Emma. You were trying to protect the family you thought you had. I can't fault you for that." She shook her head, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I called you vindictive. I said Grandma Rose would be ashamed of you. I was so wrong, Marcus. She'd be proud of what you did, proud that you stood up for yourself when nobody else would." We stood there in the courthouse parking lot, two people who'd shared a childhood but were now trying to figure out what kind of relationship was possible between the wreckage of their family. The silence stretched between us, comfortable in a way that reminded me of the brother and sister we'd been before everything got complicated. "What happens now?" she asked finally. It was a question I'd been asking myself for weeks, ever since Peterson had first explained that justice and closure weren't necessarily the same thing. The legal system had done its job, delivering consequences and restitution in the measured way that courts were designed to handle, but the emotional aftermath was messier, more complicated than anything a judge could address with a ruling. "Now we figure out who we are without them," I said. "Both of us." Emma nodded, understanding passing between us without the need for additional words. She was facing her own reckoning with the people who'd raised her, coming to terms with the fact that the parents she'd trusted had been willing to steal her future to fund their present comforts. "Tommy and I are postponing the wedding," she said quietly, "not canceling, just pushing it back until we can afford to pay for it ourselves. I don't want anything they touched with stolen money to be part of our special day." The decision couldn't have been easy, I knew. Emma had been planning this wedding since she was a teenager, dreaming about the dress and the flowers and the perfect day when she'd promise her life to someone who loved her. But she was choosing integrity over convenience, authenticity over the facade that stolen money could provide. "That takes courage," I told her. Grandma Rose always said the hardest thing about growing up was learning that the people you trusted most were sometimes the ones most willing to let you down. Emma smiled for the first time in months, a real smile that reached her eyes and reminded me of the little girl who used to follow me around the house asking endless questions about everything she encountered. "She really did say that, didn't she? I thought you might be making it up to make me feel better. She said a lot of things I didn't understand at the time," I replied. Turns out she was usually right even when I didn't want to admit it. We parted ways in the parking lot with tentative plans to have dinner later that week, two siblings trying to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by forces beyond their control. The conversation felt like a beginning rather than an ending, the first step toward whatever came next for both of us. The drive home took me through the center of town, past the diner where I'd waited for the sheriff to arrive and the bank where Peterson had first shown me the evidence of my parents' theft. Everything looked the same, but I felt different moving through these familiar spaces, like I was seeing them through new eyes that understood things they'd missed before. My apartment was quiet and sparse, still feeling temporary even though I'd been living there for months. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder Peterson had given me, reading through the final settlement documents that would govern the next phase of this process. My parents had 60 days to sell their house and turn over the proceeds to pay restitution. After legal fees and remaining debts, Emma and I would each recover about 60% of what had been stolen from us. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than many victims of family theft ever saw. More importantly, it was acknowledgement that what had happened to us was wrong, that there were consequences for betraying trust even when the betrayal came from people who were supposed to love us unconditionally. The next few weeks passed in a strange kind of calm, like the quiet that follows a thunderstorm. The legal proceedings were finished, the public drama was over, and I was left with the ordinary work of building a life that made sense without the family structure I'd always taken for granted. I found a job with a local construction company using skills I'd learned in the military to help build houses for people who were just starting their own families. The work was honest and straightforward, the kind of labor that left me tired at the end of each day but satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with money or recognition. My coworkers knew about the court case, of course. In a town this small, everyone knew everyone else's business whether they wanted to or not, but they treated me with the kind of respect reserved for people who'd stood up for themselves when it mattered, and I found myself part of a new kind of family built around shared work rather than shared blood. Emma and I had dinner every Thursday at a small restaurant downtown, neutral territory where we could talk without the weight of family history pressing down on every conversation. We talked about her job at the elementary school, about Tommy's work at the automotive shop, about their plans for a smaller wedding that would be entirely their own creation. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told me one evening over coffee and pie, "about figuring out who we are without them. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant." She'd been seeing a counselor, she said, someone who specialized in helping people process family trauma and rebuild their sense of self after betrayal. The sessions were difficult but necessary, helping her separate the lessons worth keeping from the relationships worth leaving behind. "Dr. Martinez says that family loyalty is supposed to be mutual," Emma continued. "It's not supposed to be one person sacrificing everything while other people take whatever they want." It was a lesson I'd learned the hard way through months of questioning whether I was being reasonable or vindictive in pursuing justice against my own parents. But Emma was learning it through reflection and professional guidance, which seemed like a healthier path than the one I'd been forced to walk. "Are you happy?" I asked her one evening as we walked to our cars after dinner. She considered the question seriously, tilting her head in the way she'd done since childhood when she was thinking through something complex. "I'm not happy about what happened," she said finally, "but I'm happy about who I'm becoming because of it." Does that make sense? It made perfect sense to me, more sense than almost anything else I'd heard in the past year. We were both becoming people who understood the difference between love and enabling, between family loyalty and family exploitation. It was painful knowledge, but it was also liberating in ways I was still learning to appreciate. The house sale happened on a Tuesday in October, 3 months after the plea agreement had been finalized. I didn't attend the closing, but Peterson called afterward to let me know that everything had proceeded smoothly. The proceeds were sufficient to cover full restitution for both Emma and me, with enough left over to pay the legal fees and court costs associated with the case. "Your parents are moving to Florida," he told me during our final meeting. "Apparently your father's sister has offered them a place to stay while they get back on their feet." I felt nothing when he told me this, no sadness or relief or satisfaction that they were being forced to start over in a new place. They'd become strangers to me during the legal proceedings, people I'd once known but no longer recognized. Their decision to leave town was probably best for everyone involved, allowing all of us to move forward without the constant reminder of what had been broken between us. The check arrived in the mail a week later, made out for $48,000, representing my recovered inheritance minus legal fees and the costs of liquidation. It was less than Grandma Rose had originally left me, but it was enough to serve its intended purpose as a foundation for building something better. I deposited the money and sat in my truck outside the bank thinking about what came next. The construction job was steady but not particularly well paid, and I was living in an apartment that felt more like a temporary shelter than a real home. The recovered inheritance gave me options I hadn't had before, the freedom to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. That weekend I drove out to the cemetery where Grandma Rose was buried, something I hadn't done since the legal proceedings began. Her headstone was simple granite marked with her name and dates, surrounded by flowers that someone else had planted and maintained in my absence. I sat on the ground beside her grave and told her about everything that had happened, about the theft and the investigation and the painful process of holding my own family accountable for their crimes. I told her about Emma's courage in joining the case and about the new relationship we were building based on honesty rather than obligation. "I think you'd be proud of us," I said to the granite stone that marked her final resting place. "We're not the same people we were when you left us that money, but maybe we're better people because of what we had to go through to get it back." The wind picked up as I sat there, rustling the leaves of the oak tree that shaded her grave. I chose to interpret it as approval, though I knew it was probably just weather. 3 months later I used part of the recovered inheritance as a down payment on a small house across town, a 1940s bungalow that needed work but had good bones and a yard big enough for a garden. It was the first time I'd owned something that was truly mine, purchased with money I'd earned and protected against people who might try to take it away. Emma helped me move in, bringing housewarming gifts and the kind of sisterly teasing that reminded me of who we'd been before everything got complicated. Tommy came too, carrying boxes and offering opinions about where furniture should go, treating me like the brother-in-law he was planning to become rather than the person who'd sent his future in-laws to court. "It feels like home," Emma said, standing in my living room and looking around at the walls I'd painted and the furniture I'd chosen. "It feels like you." She was right. The house was small and practical, furnished with pieces I'd selected for comfort rather than appearance. There were no stolen luxuries here, no renovations funded with money that wasn't mine. Everything was honest and earned, which made it beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with aesthetics. The first winter in my own house was harsh, with ice storms that knocked out power and snow that made driving treacherous. But I had a fireplace that worked and enough supplies to weather whatever nature threw at me. I spent long evenings reading books I'd never had time for during my military service, learning about subjects that interested me rather than things I needed to know for survival. Emma and Tommy were married the following spring in a small ceremony at the Methodist church, with a reception in the church hall that cost less than the stolen engagement party but felt infinitely more meaningful. She wore a simple dress she'd bought herself, and her smile was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with expensive decorations or catered food. I walked her down the aisle, a role that felt both familiar and strange given everything that had happened between us. When the minister asked who was giving the bride away, I said she gives herself because Emma had earned the right to make her own choices about her future. The reception was small and intimate, filled with people who genuinely cared about the couple rather than those obligated to attend by family connections. I gave a toast about new beginnings and second chances, about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose to keep. "Emma taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," I said, raising my glass to the assembled guests. "It means choosing to build something better from whatever pieces are left when the breaking is finished." The applause was warm and genuine, and I saw Emma wipe tears from her eyes as she smiled at me across the crowded room. We'd both learned things about ourselves and each other that we couldn't have discovered any other way, painful lessons that had ultimately made us stronger and more honest about what relationships were worth preserving. After the reception, I drove home through the quiet streets of the town where I'd grown up, past the courthouse where justice had been served and the bank where Peterson had first shown me evidence of my family's betrayal. Everything looked peaceful in the late afternoon light, ordinary and familiar in a way that no longer felt threatening. My house was dark when I arrived, but it welcomed me with the particular comfort that comes from owning something you've protected and maintained with your own hands. I turned on the lights and saw my life reflected back at me in the furniture I'd chosen and the books I'd collected and the photographs I'd selected to represent the memories worth keeping. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat a small framed photo of Grandma Rose, taken during my high school graduation when she'd been so proud of the man I was becoming. Next to it was the original copy of her will, the document that had set this entire journey in motion by leaving me money she'd saved through decades of careful living. I'd learned things about myself during the past year that I couldn't have discovered any other way. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd thought, more resilient in the face of betrayal than I'd ever wanted to test. I'd learned that family loyalty was supposed to be mutual, that love wasn't supposed to come with the expectation of victimhood. Most importantly, I'd learned that Grandma Rose had been right about the difference between people who deserved trust and people who demanded it. Trust was earned through consistent actions over time, not inherited through blood relationships or claimed through emotional manipulation. The money she'd left me had been stolen and recovered, diminished by legal fees and the costs of justice. But the real inheritance she'd given me was the knowledge that I was worth protecting, that my future mattered enough to fight for even when fighting meant standing alone against people I'd once loved unconditionally. 6 months after Emma's wedding, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. The return address was Florida, written in my mother's careful handwriting. I held the envelope for a long time before opening it, weighing whether I was ready to hear whatever she had to say. The letter was short and carefully worded, an attempt at reconciliation that acknowledged wrongdoing without quite accepting full responsibility. She missed me, she wrote. They both did. They were sorry about the misunderstanding with the inheritance, sorry that family business had gotten so complicated and expensive for everyone involved. She hoped that time had helped me understand their perspective, that I could see they'd been trying to help the whole family rather than hurt any individual member. They were rebuilding their lives in Florida, she said, and there would always be room for me if I decided to forgive and move forward. I read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in the drawer with other documents from the legal proceedings. It wasn't that I was holding on to anger or resentment, but I'd learned the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I could forgive them for their choices without inviting them back into a position where they could make similar choices in the future. Emma came over for dinner the following weekend, bringing homemade bread and the kind of easy conversation that had become our new normal. I mentioned the letter without showing it to her, curious about her own feelings toward the people who'd raised us both. "I got one too," she said, not seeming surprised. "Tommy thinks I should write back, try to rebuild some kind of relationship with them, but I don't know if I'm ready for that." We talked about the complexity of family relationships, about the difference between forgiveness and trust, about the possibility of building something new from the pieces of what had been broken. Neither of us had easy answers, but we both understood that we didn't need to make permanent decisions immediately. "Maybe someday," Emma said as she helped me clean up after dinner. "But not yet. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to make them happy all the time." It was a sentiment I understood completely. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what other people expected from me. It was liberating and terrifying in equal measure, the freedom that comes with accepting responsibility for your own happiness. That night I sat on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars appear in the clear sky above my small house. The air was warm with the promise of summer, and I could hear the distant sound of neighbors talking and children playing in nearby yards. Everything felt peaceful in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of conflict and everything to do with the presence of authenticity. I was living a life built on honest work and genuine relationships, funded with money I'd earned and protected rather than stolen or inherited without effort. The recovered inheritance sat in a savings account, growing slowly but steadily as I added to it from each paycheck. Someday it might become the down payment for a larger house, or the seed money for a business of my own, or the foundation for a retirement that would let me age with dignity like Grandma Rose had done. But for now it was simply security, the knowledge that I had resources to handle whatever unexpected challenges life might bring. More than that, it was proof that I'd learned to protect what was mine, to stand up for myself when standing up was difficult, to choose justice over comfort when the choice mattered. The legal case was closed, the money was recovered, and the family relationships had been permanently altered. But the real victory was subtler and more personal, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I'd become the kind of person Grandma Rose had hoped I would be when she'd first taught me about protecting what you've earned. I finished my coffee and went inside, turning off lights and locking doors with the methodical routine of someone who understood the value of security. Tomorrow would bring another day of honest work, another step toward whatever future I was building for myself. As I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw a face that looked familiar but somehow different than it had a year ago. Older maybe, but also more settled, more comfortable with the person looking back. It was the face of someone who'd learned hard lessons about trust and family and the difference between loyalty and exploitation. It was the face of someone who'd chosen justice over convenience, truth over comfort, authenticity over the facade that stolen money could provide. It wasn't always an easy face to wear, but it was an honest one, and honesty was a luxury I'd learned to value above almost everything else. The house settled around me as I turned out the last light, the comfortable sounds of a structure that belonged to me because I'd earned it rather than inherited it or taken it from someone else. I fell asleep easily, dreamlessly, with the deep rest that comes from living in alignment with your own values rather than other people's expectations. In the morning I would wake up and continue building the life Grandma Rose had envisioned when she'd left me that inheritance. Not the money itself, though, that had proven important, but the opportunity to become someone worthy of her faith and investment. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.